from a jaunty quest. Awaits me venture farther than I've been before. And no, I'm not scared, though I'm frightfully underprepared to brave the grocery store.
In the same way that my mother always had 2 Christmas trees, one with tasteful ornaments, decorated exactly how she wanted it, and one for all the scribbly, handcrafted ornaments her children would bring home from Sunday school, I have created 2 vlogs to document my pilgrimage in Europe. Like Mulan, or perhaps Joan of Arc would be more geographically on brand, my first order of business was to cut off all my hair. I did this the literal day of my flight because I was too embarrassed to be perceived by my general acquaintance after making such a bold chop. If one goes among strangers practically bald, they will think nothing of it, but it seemed too rumpus-rousing to appear at church or work one day suddenly scalped. My journey across the seas went smoothly, except for one heart-and-mouth moment when the gate attendant told me to test the size of my overstuffed hiking backpack in the baggage cage to see if it would fit. It didn't, as you can imagine. So I had to go back and look at the agent with my big doe eyes and talk a lot of rot about how it wouldn't fit because it was just an unusual shape and how it always fits in the overhead. I could see in her eyes that she bought none of this, but she let me off with a warning anyway. I mention most of the events of the first day in my other vlog. Getting prayed over by the deaf priest who thought my name was Eloise, receiving my credential and my first stamp, and being told there was a nun a few days ahead of me. She must have been thundering along because I never did catch up with her. My pilgrim status afforded me free entrance to Canterbury Cathedral and a feature on the Pilgrim Instagram. I had maneuvered my way into a free staff stay at YHA Canterbury, and since the building was totally hired out by a French school group, they put me in a charming little Hagrid's hut in the back garden. While waiting for check-in time, I stocked up on meal deals and lurked in the upstairs of a Costa, slipping into the code-protected bathroom right as someone else was vacating it in order to avoid paying for a drink. Follow me for more money-saving hacks. Much of day 2 is also recorded in t'other vlog. What is not recorded is my absolute fight to find a toilet in Shepherd's Well village. The one pub was closed. The farm shop had no toilet. The co-op employee wouldn't let me use the employee restroom. Just as I was about to shake the dust of my sandals off at them and have my piece returned to me, some construction workers reluctantly let me use their disgusting porta-pot. My first great pilgrim's tribulation was over. Some pleasant events happened. The trees were in bud, and the first signs of spring were upon the land. I saw some pheasants. Then I suddenly came upon a dog being walked off-leash who came to bark viciously at me, followed shortly by his owners, who assured me that he would never bite and that he just couldn't see very well and was afraid. Sure. I went on my way. A little while later, the trail took me through a farmer's field next to the farmhouse. Tromping through a farmer's property is neither forbidden nor unusual in England. However, the farmer's 3 dogs knew nothing of the law of the land, and as soon as I went through the gate, they all came charging. Had I not been put on my guard by the snappy, snarly fellow I had met hours earlier, I would have assumed a welcome committee. However, as I heard the barking, I began to question my safety, and as the fastest dog approached, a snappin' and a snarlin' as it very much were, I suddenly became in tune with my primal instincts of cave woman versus saber-toothed wolf. I scurried back to the other side of the gate and found a detour, stomping angrily along in the knowledge that additional distance had been added to my already impossibly long journey. This story, and the ones to follow, will make it sound like I am a hater and fearer of dogs. Verily I say unto you, until that day it had never occurred to me to be afraid of a dog. What is even more annoying is that when I would recount these tales, people would side with the dog. They would say that it was probably just scared. I don't care. I was also scared, and I don't have point-edged teeth. After these 2 traumatic encounters with small, yappy snarlers, I met a lady walking 2 very pleasant golden retrievers. I saw them coming down the trail, and could tell at once from their smiling jowls and doleful trots that they were beasts of peace. Freely, freely they came to me to receive many pats, and freely, freely many pats were given. The scales of the universe were balanced. I went on my way. I dragged myself the last few treacherous miles to Dover, where I stayed at a very cursed and dimly lit hostel. I'd read the reviews before booking, and they seemed favorable enough, but I suppose the reviewers were not as sensitive to the powerful negative auras as I. Everything seemed relatively clean, but my short interaction with the proprietor was enough to make me suspect that he was the sort of person who didn't hold with nonsense like sheet changing or using disinfectant. However, I had a pleasant indoor picnic with kind Trouty, a German school teacher, so once again the scales of the universe were balanced. She gave me her phone number, so I sent her a message when I finally arrived in Rome. I awoke with a cold and in great pain of body from my 19-mile trek the day before. Luckily, all I had to do this day was drag myself to the ferry terminal. I found a convenience store where I bought up all the cold and flu capsules they would give me, then tucked into a jolly good fry-up at one of those truly classic, unfussy English cafes before heaving my heavy bones to the port. There was a bus that took us to the boat, and at one point we all had to get off the bus, go through airport-style security and customs, and then get back on the bus. Alas, to be journeying in those good old pre-Brexit days. The ferry ride was pleasant enough. My meds had kicked in, and it was pleasant to gaze upon the sea and the white cliffs of Dover. There was a free shuttle bus, let's hear it for those dirty European socialists, from the ferry to the center of Calais. It was very crowded, and as my stop approached, I had to very bravely ask in French for someone else to hit the button for me. I am pleased to report that my boutique hotel room in Calais was lovely. I hit up the Carrefour and the laundromat, then spent the remainder of the evening in a vegetative state. Still rather sore, ill, and tired, I started day 4 by running through a freak hailstorm to go get a Calais stamp at City Hall. I stared at the clerk like a deer in the headlights and said, "Un stamp, s'il vous plaît." I based my guess that the French word for stamp was just stamp, but in a French accent, on absolutely nothing. I would later learn that for this specific type of inky stamp, the word is tampon. So for the rest of the journey, I had to go around asking random strangers for a tampon. Happy times. I had to walk along the sandy beach for some parts, and that was challenging with my heavy pack. There was a drizzle going off and on most of the day, but nothing too bad. There was a final beach stretch right as I was approaching Ouessant, and it felt like the town was simply a mirage that never seemed to get closer no matter how far I walked. Geographically speaking, Ouessant is a pointless detour, and it would have made more sense to go straight from Calais to Gouin, but I was too green to dare adapt the trail at this point, and it was a very cute seaside town, so I am glad that I stayed there. I got a gentle intro to going uphill on this day, with a gradual climb of about 100 meters. What is that in feet? No idea. I am fully assimilated to the ways of the communists when it comes to measuring. The ascent was okay. There were some ruins of World War II bunkers at the top. Satan was buffeting with the wind as his conduit, so I took a coffee break at a scary biker bar in some random town, and to my great trepidation, they had a Confederate flag hanging from the ceiling. What is the point of living outside of the United States if I still have to be assailed by this nonsense? The wind did not relent for the rest of the day, so for lunch I took shelter in a small church where a soothing CD of chamber choir music was playing. I stayed at a gorgeous bed and breakfast and was served no petit déjeuner, but grand déjeuner, complete with cheeses, meats, and a confounding supply of bread products, considering it was for only one person. I then attempted various shortcuts, which resulted in me tromping through much mud. I unlocked a never-before-seen type of pheasant in the forest and arrived in town bustin' for a wee. Regrettably, it was Sunday. Ironically, all of Europe is better at observing the Sabbath than God's own favorite nation, the USA. This is great for them, but was wildly unfortunate for me because I was fighting for my life trying to find an open establishment where I could use the bathroom. At last, I found a very intimidating sports bar, which reeked of cigarettes, and where all the patrons turned to look at me when I walked in, like I was an outlaw who had just kicked open the saloon doors. My accommodation that night was a cute converted outbuilding Airbnb on someone's property, complete with a bathtub where I soaked extensively for the healing of my agonies. I arrived in Leek too early to check into my hotel, so I shed my burden at a pleasant cafe. The lady behind the counter was very sweet, even when she asked me what I wanted to drink in French, and I stood there like an idiot, as though I couldn't have inferred from context what she was asking me, her patron, who had just walked up to the bar. My pilgrim's vocation evident from my enormous bag, she brought forth her stamp and bequeathed upon my booklet the mark of the town. My hotel room was perfectly acceptable. On my daily grocery store run, I bought what I thought was toothpaste and which I discovered was actually denture cream once I had put it in my mouth. C'est la vie. This day was sunny and consisted mostly of trekking through freshly tilled fields. I saw many a John Deere tractor in the distance and smelled many a whiff of fresh hay. I entertained myself by singing my way through those blessed musicals which I have mostly memorized. Little Shop of Horrors and Wicked were among those with which I serenaded the birds and the beasts of the field, and utterly mortified would I have been had a human overheard. In Wisk I stayed with the nuns. They had a charming guest house, and visitors could participate in life at the abbey. I was greeted by the host, Sister Lucy, a diminutive and cheerful lady who had me stop to admire some violets and buttercups growing on the lawn as we made our way to the accommodation. There were several other guests, some relatives of Sister Lucy, some devoted Catholics seeking a retreat, some folks who were interested in the history of the abbey. The nuns fed us a pleasant dinner in the traditional four-course fashion. They started us off with a simple soup, and I, not yet learned in the ways of the French, was very afraid that this was all we were going to get. However, it was followed by a main course, a cheese course, and a dessert, so all was well in the land. Dinner was followed by evening prayers in the abbey, and then to bed we did retire. This was my first official rest day, although thankfully the day I took the ferry had also been pretty restful. I started with a simple breakfast of toast with jam and butter and coffee. Then all the guests cleaned up together while Sister Lucy's nephew, retired teacher Jean-Francois, drilled me on my French verb conjugations. It was my intention to walk a fur piece to a laundromat in a neighboring town, but I got lazy and decided to wash my socks in the sink. I hung them in my room in a sunbeam, and naturally, they were not dry the next day. I arose early to attend morning prayers, which were very cool and beautiful for the first 5 to 10 minutes, and then went on forever and got boring. I attempted some more French at breakfast with fellow guests Claudine and Mathieu, then set off again on my journey. One of the things I noticed during my time in France was how normal people looked. One's first impressions of Europeans when one visits a bustling metropolis are that they are all young, thin, and impeccably dressed. But send me out into the highways and byways to a small town or a farming village, and I will show you a human being that would not look out of place at the Bourbon County Fair. I arrived in such an ordinary town that afternoon, and stayed in my very first gîte, which translates to lodge, and is the catch-all term used in France for pilgrims' accommodation. It was a very nice little house, modified to be a hostel, complete with multiple twin beds in each room, and multiple toilet stalls in the bathroom. Because it was so early in the year and not many pilgrims were traveling, I had the place all to myself. It was here that I had my first encounter with disposable bed sheets. There are a variety of quirks in the Pilgrims' Hostel that help proprietors run it at as low a cost as possible, so they can in turn charge pilgrims as little as possible. Most pilgrims bring their own sleeping bag or cocoon-style sheet, but if you don't have one, you can buy disposable sheets for a few extra euros, and that saves the facilitator of the gîte having to devote their lives to the constant work of changing beds. I also had to give the bathroom a quick wipe down before I left. Think of it as all the weird stuff you have to do when leaving an Airbnb, except you are rewarded for your toils by paying next to nothing for the accommodation, instead of just being forced to do free labor. Outside of the Carrefour, there were vending machines for pizza and paninis, neither of which I attempted to use. After I returned from my daily shop and had dinner, the owner of the gîte came to check that all was well, and then as he was leaving, he asked if I would like a tour of the town. We drove around and he showed me the local castle and where the original boundaries of the town had been. We also drove through a new neighborhood where the houses looked distinctly American. On this day, I had an interaction with a mailman who gave me directions, then headed in the same direction, but running. Once again, I trucked through many a farmer's field, observing the satisfying patterns the tractors had left behind. I took no notes on this day, but I remember that I stayed in a lovely farmhouse in Amet, and my hostess told me I must buy myself a pilgrim's booklet, because only a fraction of the pilgrim's accommodation was listed on the Via Francigena app, and thank goodness I listened to her, otherwise I would have run out of money by week 3. I was also coming to some devastating conclusions about my sneakers on this day. I had washed and dried them in Terouanne, and then somehow shrunk them in the dryer. They were nice sneakers, and also a gift, so I gaslit myself into thinking I could stretch them out by wearing them. So, many a mile and a squished toe later, I arrived at my next destination, still in denial. I had a really nice and reasonably priced hotel room, and I went ahead and splashed out for the buffet breakfast. I believe I reconciled this expense in my mind by stuffing myself to the gills, then squirreling away various packaged items, fruit, and sandwich materials for my on-the-go lunch. Since my hotel was on the north side of town and several kilometers off the trail, I had saved myself the additional suffering by bussing it up from the center of town the day before. For this day's journey, I had been unable to find accommodation in the official stopping place and had to continue a little further on to the next leg. Because of this, I planned to take a bus to the outskirts of town to start my journey from there to shave a few kilometers off the beginning. However, I was once again met by my old enemy, the Sabbath. The buses were extremely limited, but I managed to catch one that did the trick. It was a gray, cloudy day, and I trekked through the muddy former front lines of World War I, feeling roughly the same level of despair as a soldier with trench foot. At last, I saw the ruins of the cathedral of Mont-Saint-Éloi looming majestically in the distance. As I approached the outskirts of town, I encountered a mannequin being used as a scarecrow. In my case, it also made a very effective scare human. Upon entering the town, I came across a rather odd collection of life-size dolls, all dressed up and placed inside carriages.
Much to discuss, much to process, much to think about.
Here I had another very special and unique stay. There were several types of pilgrim accommodation on the trail. I had experienced the convent and the gîte already, and here I experienced my first family stay. It is exactly as it sounds. A lovely retired couple let me stay in their guest room. When I arrived, they were having tea and cake in the back garden with their daughter, son-in-law, and grandbaby. I joined for café and gâteau. Dinner was soup, then salad and quiche, then cheese course, then yogurt for dessert. They spoke a little bit of English, so we did okay communicating. I have little to report on this day, except that I passed by a massive World War I cemetery, and it would not be the last. Feeble creature that I am, I took another rest day in Arras, partly because I had initially thought I may need 1 rest day per week, and also because Arras looked interesting. I bought my pilgrim's booklet from the tourist office here, but they didn't have an English copy, so another win for French immersion, I suppose. I stayed in a Catholic retreat center where, in the traditional French fashion, I had an ensuite bathroom with only a shower and a sink, and the toilet was clear on the other end of several very long hallways. God forgive me, but I peed in the shower a few times.
Drains is drains!
I found the perfect place to treat myself to brunch, then generally minced about town. I noticed all the opticians were on one street, and it seemed there were more than you needed for the population of the town. I also started watching When Life Gives You Tangerines. I cried during every single episode. There was many a time out there in God's beautiful creation when the most joyous thought in my mind was the knowledge that when I got to my destination, I could lay in bed and watch Netflix. I got off to a rough start by going into a cafe for breakfast, realizing I didn't want what they had to offer, trying to leave, getting hit with a madame from the owner, feeling compelled to stay and order, and generally forgetting all my French and my English, and also how to be a person. I fled Arras in disgrace like some sort of Les Mis character, and was cheered on my way by violets growing in the woods. By this point, I had figured out that, God forgive me, cemeteries were excellent places to do a wee on the trail. In that flat, desolate landscape, devoid of cafes and bushes alike, a walled-in area, often bunged in the middle of nowhere, was exactly what the doctor ordered. I always made sure to keep out of splashing distance of any graves, so I should still be able to get into heaven. My accommodation that night was fine. It was an old and somewhat run-down hotel where they had gone about modernizing the room in a very surface-level way. The best example of the vibe was that I pulled back the millennial gray duvet to reveal the sort of vintage sheets one's mama puts on the air mattress to accommodate you during Thanksgiving. On the morning of this day, I walked down an avenue of blossoming trees and could smell the scent of the flowers in the air. I passed by another World War II cemetery, this one for British soldiers, and saw for the first time the grave of a soldier whose body could not be identified. The inscription on the grave read, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God." I had a big old blub at that, then went on my way. Many a dog came hurtling through their yards to bark at me as I went by. I think the backpack freaks them out. Thankfully, they were always behind sturdy fences. This day was a long one, and I was concerned about how I would handle the last 10 or so kilometers. Thankfully, toward the end of the day, I met another pilgrim named Luigi, and we walked and chatted together until we reached Peron, which made the time fly by. He had just retired and was making the most of his newfound free time. We walked past an old World War I trench, and while passing a farmer's field, he informed me that many of the potatoes used for McDonald's fries were grown in this area. We parted just before I reached the center of town. When I did reach the center of town, I came around the corner to discover a charming patisserie. I successfully ordered a raspberry mousse treat to go, even asking for une fourchette without disaster befalling me. Not long after this day, several friends asked what my favorite part of the journey had been so far. Did I answer that it was God's creation, or perhaps a lesson learned in a moment of quiet reflection on the trail? No, it was the raspberry mousse treat. My accommodation was slightly off the route. I could either walk 10 more minutes or take a 4-minute bus ride. I chose bus. I sat at the bus stop and munched my mousse and generally felt that life couldn't get much better. My walk this day was short, but my accommodation was grim. It was a freezing cold apartment full of cobwebs and dead insects, and the water in the shower only ever got lukewarm. I finally got the owner to turn the heat on for me, but it took forever to warm up, and I was in bed wearing every article of clothing I had under multiple blankets for what felt like hours before I stopped being cold. The place I was staying was an old farmstead converted into multiple forms of accommodation. Breakfast was served to me in the main house, which looked like the setting for an episode of Hoarders. On the bright side, I ran into my old friend Luigi at this time. He had now been joined by his beautiful English girlfriend, and they had been staying in one of the rooms in the main house. We had a pleasant breakfast together, and then I went on my way in high spirits because I was so delighted to be walking far, far away from that unaccommodating accommodation. I stopped in a bustling town to get groceries and have a pleasant time. There was a market going on, and I found a nice place to drink coffee and charge my phone. Assimilated sophisticate that I am, I stopped by the local bakery for my breakfast, where I waited in line behind the oldest man I have ever seen. He went about ordering his daily bread, shaking and bent over his cane, and it was truly impressive to me that he was managing the errand at all. This day of walking was rough, and it felt like it lasted forever. I stopped in a town a few kilometers short of my destination, feeling generally defeated and unsure why I was feeling so weak. Then I ate 2 Baby Bells, and the sun came out, and suddenly I had the strength to go on. This was going to be a very long day, and I started it with me yapping on Marco Polo and accidentally going slightly off course. This was okay because I saw an old abbey on my detour. It was a fresh and sunny morning, very pleasant. Pheasants kept shooting out of the underbrush. The trail became sandy at one point, which I thought was interesting. I was headed for a medieval hilltop city, and it was very majestic to see it in the distance upon its plateau. I passed another World War I cemetery, this one for German soldiers, and amongst the many crosses was one gravestone with a Star of David for a Jewish soldier. My accommodation that night was a fantastic loft apartment in an ancient house, complete with treacherous stone staircase. I went to get groceries at one of the only grocery stores atop the hill, which multiple Google reviews had described as evil. Indeed, there were several a rotting fruit and veggie amongst the produce. I stuck to pre-packaged food choices. My one note from this day reads, "Shoving detergent down washing machine hole." This was because I was terrible at attending the laundromat, and disaster always occurred there. In this instance, I had started everything going and then remembered I hadn't added detergent. The water that laps up and sloshes the detergent out of its tiny drawer had already come and gone, so I pulled the whole drawer out and began, you guessed it, shoving detergent down the washing machine hole. I guess it worked because, as I recall, everything smelled fine when it came out. My resting place this day was a charming village in the Champagne region. Breakfast was included in the cost of the room, but I opted not to have dinner and save some money. However, upon seeing me pathetically munching Tupperware pasta in her front garden, the very beautiful and kind B&B owner came sweeping out and presented me with a cheese board and several macaroons. It was an excellent experience overall, but one cheese was so strong and pungent that it was too much even for me. I never thought I'd meet a cheese I didn't like, but alas, I was too uncultured and the cheese too reminiscent of a smelly sock. On this day, I tripped on a curb and took a tumble, but luckily I had a soft, grassy landing. However, the speed and force with which I went down due to my heavy backpack had my life flashing before my eyes. I also passed by an enclosed farmyard that must have been doubling as some sort of kennel, because the howls of 1,000 dogs were emanating from it. They sounded rather pitiful. A more Christ-like pilgrim than I would have set the captives free, but,
as I said to you before, you may recall,
the dogs of the Camino were hungry for my flesh. In other news, someone had a giant slide in their backyard, and many signs warning trespassers to not even think about it. The smell of honeysuckle was in the air, and apart from being barred from the joys of the giant slide, life was good. A child in a stroller waved at me on this day, always a win. I stayed with these wholesome nuns and arrived at the accommodation at the same time as a Belgian cyclist who made a very helpful translator. The nun who checked us in was originally from Côte d'Ivoire. Many of the nuns I met on my journey were from all over the world. I attended French Mass with the nuns and had no idea what was happening the whole time, but enjoyed the vibes anyway. I had a humble toast and coffee breakfast at the nuns' abode, then made my way into town to pick up groceries from Aldi and visit an ATM. In the brief time it took to complete these two errands, I was starving again, so I had second breakfast at the nearby McDonald's. I was always excited to see a McDonald's on the Pilgrim's Way. The European ones have entirely separate McCafe counters and serve you coffee and pastries on real dishes. I think I had a breakfast sandwich and a cappuccino. Now I had to get out of the commercial area and back onto the Pilgrim's Path. I thought I could cut through the Carrefour Industrial Complex parking lot, but instead I got, you guessed it, trapped in the Carrefour Industrial Complex parking lot. I somehow escaped and proceeded to my next place of abode. It was an apartment owned by some champagne makers, and an English family was staying in the other room. The parents were planning to fill the trunk of their car with champagne to take back to the motherland, and the hostess had invited me to tag along during the champagne tasting. My brothers and sisters in Christ, I was given 6 free glasses of champagne and not a crumb to eat. It was all I could do to walk out of there in a straight line. I couldn't let on to all those real adults, who all apparently had ox-like constitutions and were perfectly fine, that I had already sailed halfway to Bubble Land. Once I made my escape, however, I passed a very pleasant evening munching chocolate chip brioche from the patisserie and roaming the town in a state of bliss. The usual bread-forward breakfast was provided at the apartment. Then I went on to the patisserie, still munching a half baguette, to stock up on more bread treats for the road. That evening was one of the most fondly remembered places of accommodation. I had a lovely host who had a gorgeous guest suite attached to her home. She was an amazing cook, and she spoke English, so we were able to converse over meals without stress. For my dinner, she made me a caprese salad, followed by spaghetti bolognese, the ubiquitous cheese course, and finally creme brulee. For my breakfast, an assortment of breads, pastries, cheeses, meats, yogurts, and fruits was arrayed for my feasting pleasure. We then went on a little car trip to see a chateau owned by a friend of my host. Her village was a few kilometers off trail, so she drove me back to the ancient path and saved me a few trials of the leg. She could not, however, save me from the trial of boredom, which was walking next to a canal. For hours it was flat, straight ahead, and looked exactly the same. I was listening to The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery, so that helped significantly, but my goodness, I'll never stroll by a canal again. I arrived in a charming city and sat on the steps of the old Hotel de Ville, people watching the folks in the plaza. Tragically, while taking off my backpack in the hostel, it caught on my shirt, and my lovely blue and white button-down was ripped a mighty gash upon the sleeve. After taking some time to process this trauma, I ventured back into the wide world, bought this enormous beast, which was advertised as a taco, and returned to my people-watching steps to munch. It was delicious for about 1/3, and then I began to feel that if I had one more bite, I would be sick and or explode into chunks. One more delight from this day I will share with you, and that is the little theaters by the river. How did they work? Who's to say? Magic, probably. Never in my life have I been so enraptured, so delighted. There were about 5 of them, all depicting a different scene, and I wish I'd filmed them all because I can't remember what the others were. This was a day of spotty cell service.
And it gets worse.
Up to this point, I had been pretty fortunate with homestays. That one pilgrim's accommodation had been pretty grim, but when it came to staying in people's guest rooms, all had been positive. My sisters in Christ, I regret to inform you that my homestay on this day involved neither cleanliness nor delicious food. It was a time of great anguish for me, as my host was so nice, but her home was so dirty. I was fed a dinner of stale crepes, I slept on a lumpy futon, and in the morning 4 pieces of toast were plopped directly onto the tablecloth in front of me. No plate. As I was leaving, she told me I had a beautiful smile, so all was almost forgiven. But boy howdy, I left with a spring in my step, knowing that I was out of that place for good. The canola flowers were now in full bloom. I saw more scarecrows, which yet again became scare humans in my case. I saw swastika graffitied on an old abandoned shed in the forest.
Much to think about.
I also began to see lines of fuzzy caterpillars all linked up head to toe, processing across the roads. I thought they were in the midst of some wicked carnal act, and that when I saw squished ones, they had been punished by God for their crimes. However, I just now Googled it, and it turns out they were just pretending to be a large snake to up their survival chances. It is I, and not they, with my mind in the gutter. I am contrite. My accommodation this night completely healed me of all trauma related to the previous evening. It was a beautiful renovated farm complex run by a tall, beautiful Dutch couple with 3 small and angelic-looking little girls who could always be counted upon to be tumbling and trotting about the courtyard in a state of idyllic frolicsomeness. I ate dinner under a flowering tree and enjoyed knowing that, while I didn't use it, my room had a private sauna. I breakfasted on these pure delights, and it was a nice change to imbibe the protein-rich traditional breakfast of the Dutch after the very carb-exclusive breakfasts of the French. I also enjoyed watching out my window the daily adventures of the 3 tiny daughters. On this fine morning, their mother was helping them rescue a chick who had fallen from a nest, which had been made foolishly in a patch of climbing ivy. They also went to help their mother feed the rest of the chickens, trotting after her in a line, tallest to smallest, each with her own little bucket in tow. Later on, they were being wheeled in a wheelbarrow. I can't remember if their mom was wheeling them or if they were attempting to wheel each other. Either way, what joy. On this day, upon entering yet another canola field, I decided it was time to indulge in some K-drama maxing and enter into the fields like so many heroines Korean. I had no love interest on hand to frolic with, and indeed, the ground is tilled mud, which is hardly conducive to a graceful and love-struck jog. But I had a nice time anyway, despite emerging streaked with bright yellow pollen. On this day, I saw a heron, always a win. They are hardly a rare bird, and I have seen many in my life, but every time I see one, I feel a fresh and unique sense of awe. I also encountered another pilgrim, an Englishman, who was wearing full jacket and long trouser combo and sweating profusely in 75-degree heat. I myself was in shorts and a t-shirt and was still drenched in both a pit. Up until this point in the trip, I had been maintaining video correspondence on Marco Polo with about 6 different group chats. As I am famous for sending Marco Polos, which can run in length from TED Talk to 3-day seminar, By this point in the journey, I had used up all my high-speed data for the month. So at this point, I had gone a few days being forced out of my constant yapping and into quiet self-reflection. Boy howdy was I bored. Also, my back hurt. I arrived in my charming destination town and attempted to visit the public library to glean some free Wi-Fi so I might make contact with the folks at home. When I asked for the password, they said they had no Wi-Fi for patrons. No spirit of Boaz at all. A pox upon them. I found a cafe with Wi-Fi where I purchased an obligatory hot chocolate and enjoyed watching a big group of friends next to me, who had all bought lottery tickets and were doing the scratch-off together with much laughter and merriment. I scooted my chair in for one of them so she could get past, and she said, "Ooh la la, c'est plus facile," which, if my limited vocab serves me correctly, translates to, "Oh, it's so easy." Was she mocking me? Were we having a genuine moment of cross-cultural connection? The world will never know. I stayed in a pilgrim's house here, one of my very first on the journey, and very pleasant it was. The lady who checked me in was doing very well speaking English until right at the end when she very confidently bid us adieu by saying, "Hello." By this time, I had given up trying to convince myself that my dryer shrunken shoes were going to stretch back out, and I left them in the closet for another pilgrim. On this day, I was reflecting how sometimes I would put on my bag and it would feel absolutely fine, and other days it would feel super heavy. I thought this was a good metaphor for life, but actually, I just needed to adjust my waist straps, and also, I had too much stuff in there. Also a good life lesson, although remarkably more prosaic. I was also reflecting on how, for me at least, experiencing the love of God feels like relief. But then, to me, relief is the best feeling in the world. Having a wee after you've been fixin' to bust, eating when you're super hungry, realizing your hope is built on Jesus' faithfulness and not your own strength. You know how it is. I arrived on the outskirts of my tiny village destination, where I found myself in conversation with a couple walking their dog. Seeing that I was a lowly pilgrim, they invited me to their house for dinner. I said yes, and we agreed that they would come collect me in a few hours. Then I went to my accommodation and panicked. Stranger danger, I thought. What could be easier pickings than a lowly pilgrim all alone in the depths of the countryside? Sure, I got no bad vibes from them, but do I, Emu Magor, fool extraordinaire, really know how to read a vibe? I don't have enough epigenetic trauma. I can't sense danger. I tried to call my mother to talk me down, but she was in the throes of teaching Sunday school. This sent me into a very unchristian moment of being ticked off to no end, so I kept spamming her to let her know I was about to be trafficked, and then they'd all be sorry. Thankfully, our old friend was visiting at the time and was helping with Sunday school, so maternal duties of talking one's insane daughter off the ledge were able to be outsourced to her. She told me that I would be fine, and she is an astute student of human nature and would never give someone the benefit of the doubt when it was not due, so I trusted her completely and was able to move on with my life. In the interim, I wandered the village a bit and saw many people of all ages out for joyrides on assorted ancient tractors. I had a lovely dinner with the couple, who lived in a beautiful and rambling old farmhouse in the next village over. I tried chicken gizzard and did not like it. More conventional parts of the chicken were also on offer.
And I enjoyed that quite a bit.
We finished the evening with a cheese course, which was more of a cheese tour because the offerings were from all parts of the nation. They were very kind, interesting people. It was a very special and memorable experience. So listen, my son, and gain my wisdom. You should never let a stranger drive you to a secondary location unless there is free dinner at stake. My backpack had been making me suffer more than usual for several days, and I couldn't seem to make an adjustment that worked. During a snack break in a random village, I saw a cross monument nearby. Whenever I saw a cross on my journey, I was reminded of the part in Pilgrim's Progress where the guy kneels at the cross and his burden falls off and rolls away to who knows where. My only problem was that my burden was not spiritual, and I needed the stuff in there. However, since my burden had been extra uncomfy, I thought a spiritual moment would perhaps be in order. I sat by the cross and said a prayer, and lo, as I stood, I suddenly took a wild hair to cinch one waist strap as hard as I could, and it worked. I walked on. I walked through a town that played host to an amusement park, and that was a great article of interest. I saw princess dress-up dresses hanging on a drying rack in someone's backyard. I saw baby pine trees growing in the forest. I saw massive canola fields. I arrived in Barsarab and attended the local McDonald's for Wi-Fi, where I saw children getting a balloon with their Happy Meal. I myself paid over €2 for a strawberry shake, and they didn't even have the courtesy to fill the cup all the way. Should have gone for the balloon. There was many a rolling hill on this day, and a bit of rain. I walked past an ancient abbey and did not buy a ticket to go in, for I was poor and running short on time. I found an abandoned walking stick and adopted it. I traversed through a forest and took an unsanctioned shortcut. During the shortcut, I began to hear a sound like the snorting of pigs. Pigs? In the forest? Perhaps there is a farm nearby, I reasoned. Then I remembered with great horror that France has wild boars. Now keep in mind, my two main references for wild boars are Princess Mononoke and Queen of Tears. Since I am neither a forest dweller equipped with arrows nor the possessor of a K-drama leading man, I figured if a boar decided to come for me, it would be Sayonara Cruel World for old Emu Magor. I reasoned that I could stay rooted to the spot and get no further from the sound, or walk on and hopefully get further away. I walked on, and I am pleased to report that I did not encounter 30 to 50 feral hogs. I stayed in the guest suite of a lovely grandmother who served me my morning coffee in a bowl, inscrutable to me at the time, and sent me on my way with a packed lunch. I had thought I would have to stock up on food on the way, but because of her benevolence, I was able to take the shorter historic route to the next town instead of the longer route which took me past a grocery store. My day was not all sunshine and roses, however, for I stopped at a cafe and forgot my walking stick there. Now keep in mind, I'd only had this stick for one day before losing track of it. I found a village with a graveyard, and I found a tall monument to pee behind. Moments after I emerged, however, I saw that a car was parked nearby, and here came an old man wheeling a bin into the cemetery.
Much to think about.
I also saw many orange slugs. This was a short day of walking, which was good because it was rainy and cold. I had a lovely stay with my hostess, Elizabeth, and a fellow pilgrim, Dominique. We went to see the local dovecote, and during dinner had much laughter and merriment as we sampled various fruit wines from the surrounding orchards. The next day, Dominique and I walked together. We arrived at our destination in time for a late lunch. This asparagus looks rather flaccid, but it was nice, and then we decided to go visit the cathedral. It was Good Friday, and we arrived in the middle of the Stations of the Cross.
What station?
Jesus falls the second time.
So we joined in. I have never done Stations of the Cross, and even though it was in French and I had mostly no clue what was happening, I enjoyed it, although I maintain my rather Protestant stance of who the heck is Veronica. After this, we went to get a stamp for Dominique at the tourist office, where we conversed with the employee who I noticed was very cute. I was not the only one who clocked this, because later, as we strolled the ramparts, Dominique asked me, "So, will you return to the tourist office tomorrow to see the beautiful Matthias?" Reader, I did not, but I hope he is thriving wherever he is, probably at the tourist office. Dominique and I finished our delightful day with hot drinks at a cafe, then went to our individual accommodations, very happy to have met and quite sad to part ways. We were now in mid-April, and the time for me to break my pilgrimage and go work a summer job was fast approaching. So I spent the morning of my day off sitting sur la terrasse and churning out job applications. Had a croque monsieur with fries for lunch, then did life admin at the library. Even a freewheeling pilgrim must do life admin from time to time. I had high and romantical thoughts of going to Easter Mass at the cathedral, and go I did, but it was freezing cold sitting in that stone building of an April morning, and since everything was in French, I got bored pretty quickly. So, rather than being uplifted and transfigured by the pomp and circumstance of the celebrations of our Lord's resurrection, I left at the end in high dudgeon and so cold that I had to delay my departure and stop at the cafe for a coffee to try and warm up. It sort of worked, but by now we were late in the morning/early afternoon, so I took the Google Maps route along the main road to save time. This involved less varied scenery and many a car zooming past, but I'm writing this having lived 1 month in Vietnam, so now I see all those shortcuts on dangerous roads were preparing me for my current era of taking my life into my hands every time I cross the street in Hanoi. God's plan is perfect. My arrival in the next town was much more optimistic than my departure. The sun had come out, and when I let myself into my B&B, I saw they had put a sign on the door that said, "Welcome home, Emily." Very sweet. I putzed around town, went into the church, and sang a bit because the acoustics were good, and I had not felt that I had gotten my true Easter worship out of my system while thinking myself into a bad mood back in the cathedral. Some lady came in and definitely heard me before I realized, but whatever. Most people pay good money to hear such an excellent chanteuse. Another pilgrim and her husband were staying in the adjoining apartment, and she and I had a good chat, wherein she confirmed that what I had heard in the forest those several days ago was in fact wild boars, and that she and her husband had not only heard them, but seen them, and she had pictures.
Much to discuss, much to process, much to think about.
I arrived in the charming village of Coublanc to some of the worst accommodation I've experienced on my trip thus far. There was no shower, only a toilet and sink 2 floors down. I was warned of this in the booklet, but I didn't know what the word lavabo meant until it was too late. There was a hot plate to cook food and a well-stocked pantry. However, the sink, famously, was 2 floors down, and this made food prep and cleanup a bit of a menace. No heat, and keep in mind, the French April is none too balmy. The most grievous offense was the bed, which was just the lying flat version of a lawn chair. Bad time to be a side sleeper with no meat on her bones, I can tell you that much. Now, to be fair to them, I do believe they were listed as emergency accommodation in the booklet, but I also felt that suffering under such conditions was just the creation of a second emergency. Upon leaving my refugee camp, I passed through the village where the wisteria upon the walls of the houses was in full bloom. I arrived in Champlit, where I knew more pleasant accommodation awaited me because Dominique was one day ahead and had sent me pictures. On my way to hit up the Carrefour, I saw a little boy, a petit garçon, if you will, sitting on a wall staring at me. Now keep in mind, from street side, the wall looked rather high. I somehow took it into my head that he had a look of distress, so I used 3 of my 5 French words and asked him if he was okay. He shook his head, and I used a few more French words to ask if Maman was in the maison. He nodded. So, heroic figure that I am, I went to ring the doorbell. I was answered by Maman, Papa, and who else but Petit Garçon, who had hopped down into his garden, where the ground was much closer to his perch, run inside, and was now grinning mischievously at this foreign fool whom he had got good. I explained my mistake to the parents via Google Translate and went on my way. Emily 0, Petit Garçon 1. I shared the dormitory in Champlit with a French pilgrim who, upon meeting me, asked, "Comment tu t'appelles?" To which I, having used up all of my 5 French words on the Petit Garçon, responded, "Oui." It was a little awkward sharing a dormitory with just one 50-year-old man, but the pilgrims are a trustworthy sort, and he spent his evening mostly FaceTiming his daughter, which did not eliminate murderous intentions, but certainly made them seem less probable. He snored, but only half the night. 7 out of 10. I started my day right by getting 3 glorious pastries and a coffee, for a grand total of €6 at an excellent boulangerie. I saw many old folk coming in to get their 6 daily baguettes, and also 10 small children all having breakfast together. My accommodation that night was a little bit out of town, and as I arrived in town, it began to rain very hard. I let my host know I'd just arrived and would be there soon, then popped into the grocery store for my provisions. Hallelujah, he came and found me in the grocery store and drove me to his B&B. I had not signed up for dinner, as there was a fee. However, because he had only one other pilgrim and probably felt bad for me, he fed me free of charge. The other pilgrim was a Flemish man, and we all had a very silly time at dinner, as the host was truly a man committed to the bit. When the Flemish pilgrim asked him if his homemade ice cream was from the store, he got a decorative sword down off the wall and threatened him with it. Dinner and a show. Excellent. Cemeteries were all well and good for a wild wee, but when a lady had other business to attend to, the great outdoors was simply not going to cut it. On this day, I discovered that, in a pinch, you can use the bathroom at the town hall. I tell my story because this may be useful to other pilgrims down the line. Never let it be said that I don't do anything for you. I saw, on this day's sojourn, a granny riding past on her bike wearing her nightgown and slippers. Walmart can only be found in a few countries, but her people can be found the world over. I saw a distant chateau on a distant hill and enjoyed listening to my playlist of songs that were big when I was in high school. What tunes do you play through your headphones, O pilgrim? Is it a hymn of the Lord? No, my brother in Christ, it is Hot Shell Ray. My host was a magical French grandmother with a magical maximalist home. Each one of us should ask ourselves every day why we aren't living like her. Why aren't we hanging baskets from every square inch of the ceiling? Why don't we have a curio cabinet in every room? Why isn't one bathroom Paris-themed and another tropical theme? Why are our lives so small, our trinkets so infrequent? Why aren't we talking in a constant stream of French at our pilgrim without needing a response, giving her an opportunity to turn her brain off after a hard day's walk? Marie, my host, sent me on my way with 2 sandwiches and an apple. I exited the cheerful and cozy sanctum of her home and began a rainy, muddy, dark journey through the forest.
Maybe I'll return a triumphant, or some beast may feast upon me whole. But hey, it's okay, 'cause I'm just heading out for the day. I'm working toward my goal.
I stopped to get some lunch at a supermarket, and with nothing but industrial buildings and supercenters all around me, I ate it while crouched in the cart corral. Despite this grim and somewhat hopeless-looking circumstance, a lady wished me bon appetit as she walked past me into the supermarket. I saw some people protesting in favor of Frexit, which, as a citizen of Her Deceased Majesties, I cannot personally recommend, but I love to see a bit of freedom of speech at work, and it is always pleasant to know that you are in a place where people can have a bit of a rant in the public square and no one is going to get run over by a tank. I arrived in Besançon, and I must say I recommend. Definitely quite touristy, but not heaving in the way that Paris is. A pleasant town to take a day trip and stroll around. On this day, as I walked, I reflected on the fact that I frequently communicate as though I am trying to get ahead of bad press. This is a great skill for a White House press secretary, but the fact is, I am going through the same level of stress without any of the financial compensation, and all because I have convinced myself that if I am not self-aware or self-deprecating enough, everyone will call their mother after having coffee with me and tell her how insane I am. This is coupled with equally frequent bouts of actually being insane over coffee and having massive embarrassment hangover for the rest of the day.
Perfectly balanced, this whole thing should be.
I saw on this day my first paraglider of the journey, a sure sign that I was fast approaching Switzerland. I got to my town of abode very early, so I went to get coffee at the village cafe. Unfortunately, the place was chock-a-block with Sunday lunchers, so I was relegated to the terrace, where I camped out for several hours until my host was able to receive me. My accommodation was an extremely old stone house turned museum turned pilgrim's lodge, with the more modern addition in the back being the place the pilgrims actually stayed. I met an Australian pilgrim who had a very Stanley Tucci and the Devil Wears Prada aura, and a Frenchman who was just there to fish. I'm delighted to report that my French was marginally better than Stanley Tucci's, and this gave me hope for the future. They say comparison is the thief of joy, but they forget that you can compare yourself to someone else and decide that you are winning. Another sign that I was approaching the Swiss border was that the infrastructure was improving. I saw many old folks on bikes and passed through a village called Ornans with many a pleasant riverfront house. Another place I would recommend to those seeking a pleasant French town to explore. I had a hard trek along a gorge made harder by the weight and balance problems created by the backpack. I emerged to find a cafe where I treated myself to a coffee and a rest. The waitstaff was a dad and his 3 small sons. The dad and the 2 oldest were all wearing matching vests and jean shorts. The youngest had not yet earned the right to the family uniform, I guess. On this day, I saw a neon pink butterfly. I also had to walk up a hill. But I put a bit of Pitbull on in the headphones, and with the support of Mr. Worldwide, I was able to carry on. Then, while sending a Marco Polo to friend of the show and of the me, Elena, I crested another hill, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a magnificent view of the Alps was spread out before me. I told her that whatever I had been talking about until that moment actually didn't matter at all, got her some video footage of the grandeur, then stopped recording, put on a hymn in the headphones, and wept. I traversed another beautiful gorge, descending this time, and on far less treacherous terrain. At the bottom of the gorge was a village, and in that village was a Chinese restaurant and hotel from whence I got an excellent cup of coffee. I was about halfway to my destination, but I decided to walk to a different town because it was on a lake. I went and faffed around by the lake for a while, then took a bus to my true destination, meaning I haven't actually walked the entirety of the Via Francigena and am a total fraud. On this day, I saw a chamois. I thought it was a deer crashing through the underbrush at first, but then who should reveal himself but one of these fine boys? I stopped in a charming cafe run by a very nice Swiss-Italian lady and had a great chat with some locals. They recommended I walk along the creekside trail the rest of the way and get a look at the waterfall, which I did. I also got caught in the middle of some kind of pre-Tour de France style parade going down the road. I did another homestay this night. I really liked my hosts, although they had many tales to tell of meeting wild animals in the mountains and barely living to tell the story. This day was my 28th birthday. I have a theory about 28th birthdays based on a sample size of 3. One of my friends was having a bad time emotionally on her 28th birthday. Another friend was in labor on her 28th birthday. I myself got lost in a tick-infested forest and spent my entire morning thrashing around in the underbrush of long-forgotten trails that led to nowhere. I fell down a slope, waded down a stream, and finally had to go back to where I started because it turns out I had taken a wrong turn. There was also a pleasant smell of cedar in the forest.
Perfectly balanced, this whole thing should be.
I then proceeded to hurt the feelings of a most beloved associate, call my mom to cry about it, and ultimately succeeded in approaching Lausanne so much later than originally expected that I had to stop in a suburb of the city and get the train to the final stop, so as not to keep my Airbnb host waiting until the midnight hour. Thus, there are now 2 sections of the Via Francigena I have not walked, and I am well and truly a fraud. Had I taken a day off on my actual birthday, I would have been left with nothing to do but overstay my welcome at Gregoire and Corinne's house, listening to more tales of nearly being stampeded by feral hogs, or bitten by angry Italian sheepdogs, until I was too afraid to go on. This is why I persevered through briar and bramble to make it to the epicenter of civilization, and I took off the next day to celebrate. Gregoire, when offering suggestions of what to do in Lausanne, said there was a super cool art museum and that I should go there instead of going to the Olympic Museum. Who would want to go to the Olympic Museum? And for what? To see some old shoe? Well, Greg, my tastes are unsophisticated as they come. I am an absolute shill for the Olympics, and I had a marvelous time at the museum. The shoe in question had belonged to Jesse Owens, and I wept beholding it. I also saw the leotards of all my favorite gymnastics girlies, and let me tell you, they are diminutive. After refreshing my sense that harmony amongst all humankind is within our grasp, I exited the Olympic Museum and got scammed by a bakery advertising a meal deal that turned out to be barely any food at all for far too high a price. I then went to a bus stop to wait for a bus, but it turned out the bus was not coming because a marathon was being run on that street. I watched the marathon for a long time and was entertained by an extended family group with about 6 children, all under the age of 5, all yelling, "Allez, allez, allez," at the runners, thus burning the verb into my memory and enriching my language skills. Later, I did go to the art museum. Their whole shtick is finding art from people who are amazing artists, but for various reasons, be it mental illness, lack of opportunity, or life getting in the way, never became known from their work. It was actually a very cool concept. 2 of the artists were from Kentucky. When I die, they'll start running my vlog on a projector screen on the back wall. I also talked to my sister on the phone and gave her some advice on handling anxiety by being as insane as possible, but in a funny way. Out-pizzaing the hut, if you will. Here are the memes I sent her to use as cognitive behavioral therapy tools. Having reached Lausanne and now journeying alongside Lake Geneva, I was now within my old L'Abri stomping grounds. It was good that I had walked this path before, in the sunshine, because this time around it rained all day and the fog hung so low that I couldn't see any of the good mountains. I paid about $600 million to stay in a hostel dorm in Montreux, but at least all was up to the Swiss standard of cleanliness. It was a ladies-only dorm, and I had a nice chat with my roommates, one from Brazil and one from Taiwan. Such culture, such enrichment. Having paid about $100 million more for the hostel breakfast, I gorged as much as possible and secreted some things away in a napkin for lunch. The good thing about a Swiss breakfast is that half of it is basically just disassembled sandwich materials, just asking to be made into lunch. It's efficient, one could say. On my walk, there were still no visible mountains, but also, thankfully, no rain. An old lady in a coffee shop was looking at the printed-out menu for the restaurant she was going to that night and asked me to read it to her because the text was so small. I have no memory of how language played into this scenario. I probably had enough French by this time that I was able to figure out what she wanted, and from there it was a matter of reading the French menu and making educated guesses at the pronunciations. Every time I'm out in public and an old lady asks me for help, I feel like Superman. My hosts this night were some of my favorites of the trip. I was in Aigle by this time, a mere bus ride away from Le Brie, and since I did a stay at Le Brie to finish this section of the trip, I actually ran into them again at the train station about a week later. They did a lot of work with refugees, and their son and his family had several young men from Afghanistan stay with them while adjusting to life in Switzerland. My final day of walking for this stint, and still not a mountain to be seen. I met another old lady in a cafe, this time one who had been drinking and reading a saucy novel, and somehow ended up with my contact info. She has yet to reach out, and this is perhaps for the best. My Airbnb was fine, just kind of weird. Sometimes one has a host who is a little too one with the earth. However, the next day, I stuffed myself with pastries, took the train to Barbelousse, ate more pastries at my favorite patisserie, then headed down the mountain to greet my old friends and make new ones at Le Brie.
Congrats to me on another jaunty quest. Okay, this will last me a few days.